A very good evening, and thanks for clicking on to the Friday edition of Vogan's European Outlook. As promised, I said that I would be talking a little bit about some thoughts with regards to the winter upcoming 2023-24. And just to mix it up a little bit, we do have a rather monotonous weather pattern, of course, across the UK and indeed Ireland, across much of Northern Europe, in fact. You have to get down into southern Europe for any kind of true summer like warmth at this moment in time. So, a couple of key things that we look at with regards to the winter season, of course. This is just to whet your appetite and give you a little bit of an understanding as to the things that I'm kind of looking towards in terms of building the forecast, but not just building the forecast, but building the ideas as we go through this, particularly second half of summer season and through the autumn, is really critical with regards to the type of pattern that's evolving, the type of drivers that we've got, whether it be the El Nino, the Indian Ocean dipole, the quasi-biennial oscillation, which of course is something that we need to consider. And there is competing factors versus pros. So there's pros and cons with regards to this upcoming winter if you want it cold, as does I, and I'm sure many people out there want it. Of course, with regards to heating bills, the elderly, the people who struggle with health and whatnot, obviously not a good thing. And of course, when you're out and about, when there's ice and snow around, of course, it's always a problem for many people. One of the aspects that I look at actually is global sea surface temperature anomalies, and you can see here that we've got some very dark reds on this chart here. What is interesting, however, is I tried to look, this is off NOAA by the way, and I tried to look to see what the data set was with regards to the time frame. But you notice here we've got some very, very strong warming. Of course, there's the El Nino developing, up against the Peruvian coast. We've got the warm water over the North Pacific, which is a little bit unusual to see. We've also got this belt of very cold waters extending all the way to the south of Hawaii. We've got very warm waters surrounding Japan, where we've got ongoing heat, of course, here. And we're also going to be paying close attention to the Indian Ocean with the Indian Ocean dipole. Now, the expectation was that it would go negative, and I know the Australian Meteorology Department was expecting it to go negative, and it hasn't done so. And we're seeing some unusually cool and unusually wet conditions across many parts of Australia. So it's going against what was expected with the developing El Nino. You would expect typically the waters to cool surrounding the Australian land mass. You would expect to see cooling over more so over the eastern Indian Ocean versus a warming of the western portion of the Indian Ocean. But we do have some pretty strong winds coming off the Horn of Africa, cooling down these waters here, if you notice, in this general region in the northwest portion of the basin. And that's distorting the wind circulation over the Indian Ocean and therefore distorting rainfall. Now, we do have a pretty robust Indian monsoon at the moment, or southwest monsoon. Again, going against somewhat of what you would expect to see with the developing El Nino. But there's a lot of competing factors here to consider with regards to the current situation, the current drivers that are in place, and the development of those drivers as we go through the next few months. We expect the El Nino to get stronger. It has been slowly strengthening, and unseasonably strong winds over the equatorial region of the Pacific has probably been slowing down that developing of the El Nino. We've also had winds in unusual places over the Indian Ocean, probably slowing down the progress of a negative Indian Ocean dipole. And of course, we've got very warm waters stacked up across the northern ocean basins at the moment as well. And that is also distorting the pattern. And even with the August forecast, which I will be releasing next week, by the way, I'm going to be working on that next week and release it next week before we get to the 1st of August. I'm going to be talking more about the potential for tropical systems developing over the Atlantic. With that warmer water further north, you would expect them to possibly develop further north, strengthen further north, and indeed maintain themselves further north than usual. And that has big impacts on our pattern here in the UK, Ireland, and indeed Europe as well. But I would expect to see that El Nino developing here, and what I would also be looking for is some sort of a cooling developing here to the south of this, very, very warm waters here. Now, by the way, if you look at the CFSV2, it's interesting. Not the CFSV2, sorry. This is the tropical tidbits. This is the database here is actually the 1981 to 2010. Notice here that we have nowhere near as angry reds. Now, the temperature bar shows as high as 5 or 6 Celsius above average. And you notice here it's nowhere near as extensive in this chart versus what we're seeing with the NOAA chart here. That is a much wider area of +5 Celsius above average in this region here. So it is a little bit confusing depending on what chart you actually look at, because it looks as if there's a little bit less intense heat surrounding Newfoundland up into the Baffin Straits, and you've got a little bit of cooler water here extending from south of that warm patch and extending up towards the UK here. And this is exactly what I was kind of saying what would happen over the last 3 or 4 weeks. As we lower pressure further north, we then start to take some of that heat energy out of the water. Still warmer than average, yes, but not as intense as it was back at the end of June because of the upper air shift in the pattern here. But it's a very interesting situation here. Cool along the Aleutian chain. We've got warmth here off Canada, cold off North America, off the United States, and then of course we've got the developing El Nino here. Now looking at the El Nino, this is the Nino region. Let's have a look at Nino 1.2 first. So that's the area closest to South America, and you can see here the forecast indicates this kind of sharp rise. It's actually record-breaking warm waters, by the way, for the time of the year at least. But you notice here that there's a sharp decline here, according to the CFSV2, with regards to that warm water against the South American coast. Now, if we head out towards Nino region 3, you can see too that there is a drop off in terms of this. The broken dashed black line is actually the ensemble mean here of the CFS. Notice here that some of the actual members indicate that we continue to see a strong warming taking place in Nino region 3. So what is Nino region 3? Well, you can see here that it's the region just to the west of 1.2, and then you've got region 3.4, and then Nino region 4. So if we go back to the CFSV2, you can see here, even if we go out to 3.4, which is towards the central portion of the Pacific, all of the ensembles see a bit of a drop-off taking place during the second half of the summer season here. Then what's important about that, folks, is that if you start to see a drop-off, it indicates to me that we're not going to super Nino strength like we've seen in 2015, 2016, of course. If we had a super El Nino, and if we have warm waters against South America, I would probably say that it's almost a very, very high likelihood that we would have a warmer than average winter. Stronger jet stream, stronger polar vortex, and whatnot. The El Nino tends to override the system the stronger it is. That being said, however, see if we can start to remove some of this warm water away from South America towards the region of Nino 3.4. That would indicate a different type of possible upper air setup as we go into the winter season. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we've got quite a strong negative NAO during the month of July. Sometimes a negative NAO in July can correlate to a negative NAO even during the first half of the winter season. And remember last autumn we had a negative NAO. We had the tropical systems that were recurving over the North Atlantic. We had a favourable MJO of 6, 7, 8 into 1. And I made mention of the fact that we had that back during, I believe it was September, and we actually had the coldest first half of September since 2012, I think it was. And I said to you that there was a possibility that this type of pattern could repeat itself 2 months down the road. We had some very wet conditions as well during that autumn season. And then, of course, we had the coldest December since 2010. So patterns can repeat themselves, and even patterns that are taking place now can have influence and repeat themselves 2, 3, 4, even 5 or 6 months down the line. And that's something that I'm paying close attention to here. But off the CFSV2, this is the water temperature forecast for August. And you can see here that we do have a stronger El Nino starting to show up. That's probably moderate, if not borderline strong. But what I want to show you here is if you look at September, you notice that we start to kind of slightly shift that warm water, the core of warm water, off South America and towards the central portion of the Pacific, known as a Modoki El Nino. And this is October, this is November. And notice also, so the El Nino is an important factor. It is shifting away from South America. If that happens, like we've seen in 2009, 2009-10, then we could have a greater chance of seeing blocking across the North Atlantic and Greenland, so a negative NAO. We've seen that, of course, this July so far. The type of pattern that we've got at the moment could repeat itself, in the early to mid portion of the winter season. Now, the quasi-biennial oscillation, I don't have the charts on today because this is just a summary, but the quasi-biennial oscillation, or QBO, that's the zonal mean winds over the equatorial region of the planet. The reversion from westerly, which tends to favour stronger jet stream, stronger polar vortex, milder conditions across the UK and Europe. But we're going easterly, so the winds look as if they're reversing from west to east to east west, if you catch my drift. Sometimes what happens is, with a reverse in the mean zonal winds over the equatorial region, that sometimes can have a frictional effect on the jet stream, the polar jet stream that affects our weather, slows it down. Also can have an impact on the polar vortex and weakening the polar vortex here. So the quasi-biennial oscillation looks as if it's going easterly. The CFSV2 has that warmest water over the Pacific shifting west. And if you notice here, folks, we have a little bit of cooler water now showing up in the models, extending off North America and into the eastern portion of the North Atlantic here. So there's a bit of a tripole showing up of warm, cold, warm. And that sometimes can reflect in the atmosphere and produce a blocking area of high pressure over the North Atlantic and over Greenland, and therefore you send colder intrusions of air into a trough that sits close to the UK and indeed Ireland here. So there's a few positive aspects to consider with regards to this upcoming winter season here, and I'm quite intrigued to see what the models are showing here. So this is January 2024, long way out, of course, but this is just the ideas that I'm now starting to look at, consider. We'll have a look at the Indian Ocean Dipole in the next few months. We'll look at the continuation of the El Nino. We'll look at the continuation of how the North Atlantic sea surface temperatures are progressing through August, September, and October. How much rainfall we get during the autumn season can have an impact as well, of course. And of course, the hurricane season, we need to consider that as well. But certainly we have got very, very warm waters that shifted literally across the Atlantic. If you notice here, because of the type of pattern that we had during June, we had the focus of this marine heat wave over and surrounding the UK. Now that's over the other side of the North Atlantic. And if we start to cool these waters here between that warm water and the UK and Ireland, it could get very, very interesting in terms of feedback to the atmosphere as we go forward here. So these are just some of the ideas that I have with regards to the winter season. We also look at Siberian snow cover during the month of October. I'm not a big fan of that idea, actually. More extensive snow cover tends to sometimes lead to more blocking over the North Atlantic and the Arctic region. I'm not entirely convinced about that signal. Also, the solar cycle, we're starting to get stronger signals. We're starting to increase the strength of the sun with the 25, of course, solar cycle 25. That's another thing that needs to get taken into consideration as well. But there's 50-50 at the moment here with regards to a cold winter versus warm winter. A lot of focus being on warmth with El Nino, but that isn't always the case. July is a perfect example, by the way, of that being the case. A lot of excitement getting taken into consideration. Warmest June on record. We're going for the coldest July in a few years, by the way. Who would have thought that? Ran out of time. See you Sunday with the global weather report.